Why Goodfellas never showed what happened during the Lufthansa Purge. Goodfellas make the Lufthansa heist feel like the peak. The planning, the execution, the sheer scale of the money. But what the film only hints at and never fully shows is what came after. And it was far darker than the robbery itself. The money was stolen, yes, but it destroyed everyone who touched it. The notorious Lufthansa heist took place on December 11, 1978. The robbery began around 3 a.m. at the Lufthansa cargo building at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. Masked gunmen took 10 employees hostage and completed the robbery in about 64 to 90 minutes. The crew stole approximately $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry, totaling nearly $6 million, which was the largest cash robbery in U.S. history at the time. However, this heist set off a chain reaction that left a trail of bodies in its wake.
The Lufthansa cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport. The FBI says $2 million. The city cops say $5 million.
At the center of that aftermath was Jimmy Burke, better known as Jimmy the Gent, a man who didn't panic, didn't act impulsively, and didn't believe in luck. He believed in risk. Within 3 days of the robbery, the FBI had already identified him as the likely mastermind. Just 3 days. That meant surveillance, pressure, and a growing list of names tied to a $6 million crime. As a result, every participant became a potential witness. Every witness became a liability.
And these are the guys that Jimmy put together for what turned out to be the biggest heist in American history.
You see, the problem with a score that big isn't the robbery itself. It was the number of people involved. Dozens of individuals had knowledge of the operation, including drivers, planners, insiders, and handlers. Each one represented a potential weakness. Each one was a possible informant, and Jimmy understood that.
Frenchie and Joe Buddha had to round up the workers. Johnny Roast Beef had to keep them all tied up and away from the alarms.
The crew had pulled off one of the largest cash robberies in American history. There was money everywhere, millions in cash, jewelry, and foreign currency. For a brief moment, it felt like they had beaten the system. But that illusion didn't last, because almost immediately, people started making mistakes. Some couldn't help themselves. They spent money too quickly, bought expensive cars, wore flashy fur coats, lived bigger than they ever had before. It was exactly the kind of behavior that attracts attention after a major heist. To outsiders, it might look like excitement. To Jimmy, it looked like exposure. That's when everything changed. Jimmy stopped seeing a crew and he started seeing risk. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. If even one person got picked up and decided to cooperate, everything could collapse. The money, the freedom, the entire operation. It would all be gone. And in that world, there's only one way to deal with that kind of threat. You eliminate it. You and me. What followed is often referred to as the Lufthansa Purge, though it wasn't a single event. It was a process, quiet, controlled, intentional. People connected to the heist began disappearing. Some were called to meetings, but they never returned. Others were found dead under circumstances that pointed back to the same source. A few simply vanished without a trace. And the most unsettling part is that many of them never saw it coming.
Yeah, you're always taking the late for your own funeral.
The film shows pieces of this. Bodies appearing, names fading out of narration, the stolen getaway van crushed in a junkyard, but it never shows the process itself, because the process wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was personal. It was a man calling people he knew who trusted him and decided they weren't going to leave those meetings alive. The first two to go was Parnell Stacks Edwards, the man responsible for disposing the getaway van. When he failed to get rid of it quickly, leaving it to be discovered, he didn't just make a mistake. He created a trail.
It was all over the television. They even said they came up with prints off the wheel. It was just a matter of time before they got to Stacks.
Stacks was killed in his own apartment. It was swift, quiet, and decisive. After that, the pattern began. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker whose tip made the heist possible, disappeared. The gunman who carried out the robbery, men Jimmy had personally selected, began to vanish as well. Robert McMahon, Angelo Sepe, Luis Carfora, Joe Manry, one by one, the circle tightened. Within 6 months, most of the people connected to the heist were either dead or missing.
It was terrific, yeah. Nuncio up in the...
What makes it more unsettling is that Jimmy wasn't reacting to betrayal. He was eliminating the possibility of it. That's the psychological reality Goodfellas only hints at. The crew didn't fall apart overnight. It eroded. In the end, almost no one benefited from the heist. Most of the people directly involved were dead before they could even be charged. Now, one might wonder, why didn't Paul Vario intervene and stop this, instead of letting his own people die so easily?
But I got nowhere else to go, Paulie. You're all I've got, and I really, really need your help.
The answer is that most of them weren't truly his people in the way that would have forced action. While the Lufthansa heist was tied to the Lucchese family, many of the participants were associates and not made members. They operated under the crew but didn't have the protection that came with being formally inducted, and that distinction mattered.
Now I gotta turn my back.
Jimmy Burke himself wasn't a made man either, but he was a top earner with significant autonomy. As long as money flowed upward and problems were contained, Vario had little reason to interfere. From his perspective, Burke wasn't creating a problem, he was removing one. In that hierarchy, protection wasn't about loyalty, it was about status, and most of the men who died simply didn't have enough of it. The only men who went to prison specifically for the robbery was an airport insider who provided information. The men who actually carried out the crime never stood trial for it. Even Henry Hill, who had spent years around Jimmy, saw it coming, and that's when he ultimately decided to confess to the FBI.
Jimmy was cutting every link between himself and the robbery, but it had nothing to do with me.
As a result, Henry survived, but not because he outsmarted anyone. He saw the pattern and realized he was part of it. When he faced his own charges and understood that Jimmy would eventually turn on him, he made a different calculation. He cooperated. He disappeared into witness protection. His survival wasn't a victory, it was timing. Jimmy Burke himself was never convicted for the Lufthansa heist. He eventually went to prison for unrelated crimes and died there in 1996. The defining act of his life, the crime that made him infamous, was never formally tied to him in court. That's the final irony. The real story of the Lufthansa isn't about how the money was stolen. It showed how fragile their world actually was. The heist made them rich for a moment. The purge that followed showed them exactly what that wealth was worth. Nothing.